discussed this car smoking thing as part of the task force process. And one of the issues that was raised was, are we then going to be incentivizing people to drive as opposed to disincentivizing people to drive, which we do now, because we're a downtown urban campus, parking is very limited and expensive. So we really encourage people to take bus. And if we're doing this policy, are we going to be making more people drive to campus?
Yeah, great question.
How does that handle the
Great question. Here, and it's really important to help you understand something. What people think others are going to do as opposed to what they actually do are sometimes very different things. What our experience is that when institutions adopt policies to make their campus smoke-free or tobacco-free, and then they say, we're choosing not to enforce the policy in people's private vehicles, what actually ends up happening is there's not wholesale use of tobacco in people's private personal vehicles. It doesn't go up dramatically. There's not damage to the parking lots, which is always feared. They're going to be dumping the ashes, throwing the cigarettes out on the parking lot. They're going to be getting out of their cars and walking to the buildings and smoking still. We don't see, it's not that there isn't any of that, but we don't see anywhere near what people predict is going to happen from that. My guess would be that it would, and it's an educated guess, but it's only that because I don't recall having worked with a campus that's actually been in that situation, and I don't know what their actual experience is. But my guess is it really won't change the behavior of people as much as we think it might, especially if your population is a bit younger, because the one thing about younger smokers is they're not yet as addicted as older smokers, and they particularly don't see themselves as addicted because they can engage in smoking and not smoking. They aren't constantly having to feed that need. There is a sense in which they binge smoke, binge drink, and do it intermittently and don't feel, I'm not saying this is true of everyone, but as a generalization among younger students, the behavioral patterns around smoking are much more all over the place. Now, some of you know a lot more about this than me. Am I fairly accurate as a generalization in what I'm saying here? Because if I'm not, I need to be corrected. Yes, sir.
I want to say two things about what you're saying. First of all is a story that somebody just told me yesterday about approaching a student who was smoking in a non-smoking area of our campus and telling them, we have a smoking shelter about 100 feet away, would you please move over there? And the student replying, it's too far away, I've got a class in a few minutes, I'm going to smoke here. So are they actually going to go to the car and get in their car and smoke? I sort of doubt it. The other thing is, I'd like you to address, what about just remaining silent in the policy about smoking in cars? Just not saying anything.
And that's a decision that some institutions have made to try to get around. They don't want to be encouraging people to smoke, so they don't want to say we're not enforcing. They'd like to have that hung over people's heads a little bit so that maybe they'll interpret that, and so they'd rather say nothing on the subject. What I know about that is, from my experience with students, is that in a nanosecond, students know. They know whether it's being enforced or not. And the people who are going to be engaging in enforcement, especially the safety and security, which is the central core, are frustrated when things are left unclear of that nature. And we do need to talk a little bit about how to broaden the group of people who enforce the policy beyond safety and security. Because as I've said from the outset, you're not going to be successful with the policy if you're going to rely on safety and security to do it alone. The good news is the extension of the people who are involved in enforcement only has to occur for about a year or so, and then the culture changes enough that safety and security can carry the day by themselves. But you've got to get high-ranking, high-profile administrators and others involved in enforcing the policy once you go into the hard enforcement phase. That has to happen, in my experience. Otherwise, you're just falling back on the previous enforcement approach, which, let's face it, has not proven to work very effectively, which is relying upon safety and security to enforce. But in regard to your question, my answer is institutions have chosen to do that, but it doesn't seem to resolve the problem. And then you get people who are real ardent supporters of the policy saying, you got people smoking all over your parking lot out here. What are we doing about that? Well, we don't say, we're not saying it's okay. Yeah, but we're not enforcing it. So now you've got people that are on the side of getting tobacco off the campus that are raising heck about people smoking in the parking lots. What are you going to do about that? So you get this push-pull effect, and it's a problem. It's a lot better, from my experience, if you just come right out and say, at this time, we choose not to enforce the policy in people's private vehicles, because that hangs over people's head, smokers' heads, the notion that we could, whether we really could or not, because we're saying at this time, and that lets us buy then them being respectful in how they use tobacco out in the automobiles. I'll come to you, sir, after this one.
What about the e-cigarettes?
Ah, big factor. I'll come back to e-cigarettes in a minute.
What is a reasonable time to implement a policy?
For a policy to become mature enough in the institution that it really doesn't have to be heavily enforced.
Well, say when you get the approval of the board,
Mhm.
this will, I know you guys had 3 years.
Yeah, you don't need that long now. I recommend about a year from the time that the policy is established or announced that it's going to go into effect. I recommend about a year before it's actually implemented, and then I recommend at least one term after implementation called a soft rollout, where there's no enforcement. You continue to seek compliance. During the period of time from the announcement of the policy till it goes into effect, you're educating and seeking compliance and telling people what their responsibilities will be. Then when the policy goes into effect, you continue to, as I call it, assume that every person you see on campus violating the policy is a visitor, and this is their first day on the campus. So you educate, seek compliance with them. Now you know some of them are not. You know some of them are going to choose to respond to you in inappropriate kinds of ways, and that has to be addressed as to what do we do about that. Do we ask people to just look the other way when individuals choose to be rude and mean-spirited to our safety and security staff? I mean, we got to ask ourselves some serious questions here. Now, I'll guarantee you, if the president and some deans and some directors and some high-profile people are part of that enforcement process that are doing in the first semester of the soft rollout, the talking to people, we're not expecting people to go out of their way to go search for people violating the policy. But in the normal goings and comings to the campus, we expect a group of administrative people, certainly, and others, to actually be engaging with people when the soft rollout occurs, and then in the following time frame, which would be then the next term, we would have the more serious enforcement piece go into place. Now that enforcement mechanism is dependent upon identifying people who are choosing to be repeatedly non-compliant. It's a whole different matter if somebody forgot or doesn't know about the policy or slipped, and it's quite a different matter if a person has been talked to and asked to be compliant, treated with respect, reminded about the policy, and they've had that occur 3 times. And now we know that there's something else at work here. They're making a choice. And now that lets us raise the question of maybe this isn't the institution you should be attending if you are choosing to be serially, repeatedly non-compliant with the policy. That's the kind of, I recommend a very low-key, low-level fine. $15 is what I recommend, but it can't be a lot lower than your parking fine. So if you've got parking fines that are $25, then I would recommend something like that. What you don't want to do is have people thinking that or using the argument that you're doing this to make money, because you'll get that argument. If it's a $100 fine. The other problem with a $100 fine is, because I know a lot of places that they're somehow or other happy with a $100 fine. The problem with a $100 fine is that some people won't enforce the policy as rigorously when the fine is $100 as they would if it were $15. And I like another thing. I like to allow the student, usually it's a student, in the experiences I've had, rarely do staff or employees get fined because they'll tell you they're going to be non-compliant, but when it happens, you get to the policy, they're going to go along with it. That's the experience we have in countless institutions that we work with. You get a lot of verbal threats, but when it gets right down to it, employees understand basically that, look, I work here, this is a policy, I'm going to comply with it even if I think it's stupid. But my point is that what I like to offer in addition to the $15 or $25 fine is 2 hours, a suitable length of time, of picking up refuse on campus as an option so we don't take food out of some student's mouth or their child's mouth.